Well, you hear these words from the book of Exodus, chapter 3, verses 1 to 10. Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, I will go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up. When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, Here I am. Do not come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. Then he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. At this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. The Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of the land and into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the home of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. Now the cry of Israel has reached me, and I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So now go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. These verses that I just read in chapter 3 are the beginning of what is probably my favorite story in the entire Bible. For most of the years since I received my call to vocational ministry as a teenager, I've related on a very deep level with Moses in this moment. Now, of course, for the sake of time, I cut the story a little bit short. I didn't read the whole thing. The story actually continues all through the rest of chapter 3 and through most of chapter 4 as well. So in the midst of this two-chapter long conversation between God and Moses goes on to offer 5 different excuses to God about why he shouldn't or can't go and set the Israelites free. So the first verse, the first excuse comes in the very next verse after we stopped reading. Moses simply asks, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? Feels like a fair question. But God responds to Moses in that moment and reminds him that Moses is not going on his own. He is going, sent by and empowered by the God of his ancestors, who is promising to go with him and be with him in that moment. Moses' second attempt to get out of this comes a few verses later when Moses asks, suppose I go to the Israelites and I say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you. And they ask, well, what is his name? Then what shall I tell them? So to sum that one up, Moses' excuse or perhaps his fear is, well, what if I don't have all the right answers? Third, Moses asks, well, what if they don't believe me or listen to me? And then fourth, Moses says, pardon your servant, Lord, but I've never been eloquent, neither in the past nor since you have spoken to your servant. I am slow of both speech and tongue. And finally, Moses comes down to the crux of the issue in Exodus chapter 4, verse 13, when he offers his final feeble attempt to get out of what God's calling him to do, when he says, pardon your servant, Lord, please send someone else. And I feel that on such a deep level. I mean, maybe not now, but over the years, I have very much felt that sentiment. If I could sum up most of my teenage years and not a small chunk of my 20s, when I'm being honest, if I could sum it all up in one Bible verse, it would be Exodus 4:13. I'm sorry, God, but while I appreciate you asking, can you just send somebody else? I really do stand by that connection that I feel to Moses in these couple of chapters, as I'm sure that all of you also have Bible characters that you connect to for one reason or another. Because who doesn't want to be Noah or Elijah, Abraham, David, Moses, Peter, or Paul, or any of the other heroes of the faith? But here's the important thing that I've learned about Scripture. We can and should only draw those analogies and likenesses between us and the biblical characters out so far. in these moments of failure and weakness, like Moses at the burning bush, it's okay for us to see ourselves in those places and relate to their weakness and frailty. But in the moments of strength and success, like when Moses is leading the people of Israel out of Egypt, we should not see ourselves, but instead we should see Jesus. So let's continue with Moses as the example here. God doesn't respond to all of his questions by saying, well, Moses, you have everything that you need inside of you. You just have to believe in yourself and you can go do it. No, God's response time and time again, not just to Moses, but to countless people throughout the Old and New Testament is, I will be with you. Moses doesn't deliver the people of Israel because he was sufficient in his own power and strength to do so, but he does it because he's empowered to do so by the God of the universe. And so in the triumphs of the Old Testament and New, we should not see ourselves in our own potential, but instead we should see a preview and a foretaste of who Jesus is. We continue in our gospel series here today, and we look now to the book of Exodus. As always, it's important for us to reiterate our two core assumptions as we're working through this series for the next year. So first, Jesus is the gospel. The good news is not about what we can get out of God, but the good news is Jesus himself, the King over all of creation. And our second assumption is this: the Bible is a unified story that leads to Jesus. All of Scripture works together and points toward Jesus, the good news that we declare to the world. So the book of Exodus, the second book of the Torah now, is once again not just a book hanging out in its own world, disconnected from anything else in the Bible, but instead it's a continuation of the book of Genesis. Exodus picks up right where Genesis left off. There's a brief genealogy recap at the beginning of the book of Exodus, which, just like in the book of Genesis, often signifies a transition point between different time periods in the story. And so then Exodus 1, 6, and 7 picks up after that genealogy and says this: Now Joseph and all of his brothers died, but the Israelites were exceedingly fruitful. They multiplied greatly, increased in numbers, and became so numerous that the land was filled with them. So Exodus, if you would remove the chapter and verse markings that we've put in there over the years, it would honestly just read like the next story in the book of Genesis. And so if you weren't here last week, then that means that you need to understand a couple of things about the book of Genesis in order to understand this sermon about Exodus, and really most of the sermons that are going to follow here. So there are two significant promises in the book of Genesis that God offers to his people that we're still waiting on God to fulfill, even now a book in. So the first promise comes in Genesis 3, after Adam and Eve eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And God places a curse on the snake, the one who tempted Adam and Eve to rebel in the first place. And God places this curse on the snake, and he promises that one day a descendant of the woman will crush the head of the snake. Meaning that one day a descendant of the woman will destroy the one who opposes God. But the snake crusher is yet to make an appearance. And unfortunately, the main characters of Genesis often found themselves looking more like the snake than the snake crusher. The second promise that God made to his people and made specifically to Abraham that we're waiting on him to fulfill is that they will one day inherit the land of Canaan, and that the descendants of Abraham will dwell there, with God continuing to be with Abraham's descendants in that place. He will continue to be their God, and they will be his people. But not only has that promise not been fulfilled, but now the book of Genesis ended with Abraham's descendants finding themselves in a foreign land, in Egypt, waiting for God to move. So we jump into Exodus now, where not only have Jacob's descendants not left, but they're having a couple of issues. Exodus 1, 8-14 says this: Then a new king, to whom Joseph meant nothing, came to power in Egypt. Look, he said to his people, the Israelites have become far too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous, and if war breaks out, they will join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country. So they put slave masters over them, to oppress them with forced labor, and they built Pithom and Ramesses as store cities for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. So the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and worked them ruthlessly. They made their lives bitter with harsh labor in brick and mortar and with all kinds of work in the fields. In all their harsh labor, the Egyptians worked them ruthlessly. So the book of Exodus then is split up really into two main sections. The first is chapters 1 to 18, which we know as the story of Exodus, the story of the Exodus. It's the story of God's people being set free from their captivity in Egypt by means of plagues and miracles that God brings about through Moses. And then there's a journey from Egypt to Mount Sinai where Moses meets with God on the mountain. And so then there's this transition chapter in chapter 19 where the Israelites finally arrive at Mount Sinai. They prepare themselves to encounter God in that place, though it's only Moses and Aaron who are actually able to go onto the mountain and be near God's presence. Then the second section of the book of Exodus is chapters 20 to 40, in which Moses receives and the Israelites affirm their willingness. They agree. They say that they're willing to do this, to enter into a covenant relationship with God. And there's stipulations put on that and how the Israelites are supposed to act. And then they're also given instructions for how to create the tabernacle, God's dwelling place, so that he can come and dwell with his people. So the main bulk of the narrative portion of Exodus then is, of course, the story of the Exodus from Egypt there in that first half of the book. And we've already read about Moses getting called by God, and eventually he goes down to Egypt, and he confronts Pharaoh, telling him to let God's people go. And I've always had to wonder how Moses expected that first encounter to go. I mean, God sent him, right? As someone who's perpetually impatient with God's timing and just wants him to immediately make things fall into place, I wonder if Moses went into that first meeting expecting it to end with Pharaoh releasing the Israelites from captivity. But instead of the Israelites being released from captivity after that first meeting, Pharaoh instead chooses to make things harder, giving them more labor and more things that they have to accomplish each day. And so when walking away from this encounter with Pharaoh in that moment, I wonder if this is a moment in which Moses thought to himself, did I hear God wrong? Did I mess this up? Am I making things worse? I mean, life is only getting harder for the people of Israel, so surely that couldn't be a part of God's will, right? Well, that's actually pretty much exactly what Moses is thinking is going on. It's what Moses says in Exodus 5:22-23. Moses returned to the Lord and said, "Why, Lord, have you brought trouble on this people? Is this why you sent me? Ever since I went to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has brought trouble on the people, and you have not rescued your people at all." After one single failed attempt, Moses is wondering where God is at. And yet, how much more are we able to look at Exodus and see God's power at work because of Pharaoh's resistance? Now, from a 20,000-foot view of the book of Exodus, really all this is continued conflict between the snake and between God's people. The snake, of course, here being represented by Pharaoh. Pharaoh becomes basically the most wicked character that the Bible has seen since the snake itself, and is constantly pitting himself up against God's will, doing everything that he can to resist God's will for humanity and specifically for God's people. And some of you, if you know the story of Exodus well, you're probably thinking to yourself, watching this, that, well, yes, Pharaoh opposes God, but it's only because God hardens his heart. He's making Pharaoh the bad guy in this story. In Exodus 7:3-4, God does tell Moses, he says, "But I will harden Pharaoh's heart. And though I will multiply my signs and wonders in Egypt, he will not listen to you." So people often read that passage in chapter 7 of the Exodus, and they become sympathetic with Pharaoh at that point, see him instead of the villain as a victim. They argue that God had always destined him to fight on the losing side of a battle, and that God forced Pharaoh to be the bad guy in the story, to resist his will. But I think that's actually overlooking a significant piece of Scripture and of the story that follows. Because see, there's actually a progression in Pharaoh's story. Yes, God does tell Moses that he will harden Pharaoh's heart. That is absolutely true. But notice that he doesn't do it immediately. For the first 5 plagues, Pharaoh is doing just fine at opposing God's will on his own account. After the plagues of the Nile turning to blood, the plague of frogs, gnats, flies, and then the death of the livestock, Pharaoh hardens his own heart. God doesn't have anything to do with it. It's actually not until after the 6th plague, the plague of boils, that we're told that God hardens Pharaoh's heart. And then this continues until after the 10th plague. And I honestly do think there's a lesson in that. Eventually, there was a point of no return for Pharaoh, in which God finally took away the choice from Pharaoh to be obedient to God's will, and God chose to harden Pharaoh's heart instead. And while this is only a side point of the sermon today, I think it's an important thing for us to see in this conflict between God and the snake. There is a point that can come in our own lives that if we give in to the serpent and willingly disobey God's will enough times, eventually there will be a point in which God will choose to use our disobedience rather than offer continued chances to change. So the story moves ahead, and finally, after the death of all of the firstborn of Egypt, Pharaoh finally relents and lets the people of Israel go, with the Egyptians giving all sorts of gifts of gold and silver, jewelry on their way out. Then, after the Israelites are on their way out, God once again hardens Pharaoh's heart. And Pharaoh then chases after the Israelites. He traps them between his armies and the sea. But God then parts the waters of the sea, allowing Israel to walk through on dry ground, delivering them from Pharaoh's armies. And then the waters flood back over the armies of Pharaoh, and the water washes clean the work of the serpent in the lives of his people. And yes, I use that language of flood and washing clean very intentionally because we've heard a story like this before, and we're supposed to see a parallel. The parallel between the crossing of the Red Sea and the Great Flood is intentional and profound. Just as the floodwaters cleansed the earth of the wickedness during Noah's time, the parting of the Red Sea served as a cleansing and deliverance for the people of Israel. The oppressive powers of Pharaoh, symbolizing the serpent-like forces of evil, are defeated, and God's people emerge out on the other side, washed clean from the bondage of Egypt. And in the midst of these incredible miracles that God does for the people of Israel, it becomes important for us to remember that this liberation of the people of Israel from captivity is not an isolated event in and of itself. It's a part of the overall narrative of God's ongoing and still not completely fulfilled promise to crush the head of the serpent. The Exodus narrative invites us to recognize God's relentless pursuit of his people and his commitment to fulfilling his promises, even when circumstances seem impossible to overcome. So you would probably now think that after God's miraculous work in the life of his people, that the Israelites would now completely and totally trust God's will and God's plan for every turn of the journey because he's gotten them this far, and so why would they stop trusting him now? Why would they not just totally trust him? And you would, of course, be very wrong in thinking that that's what's going to happen next. Because I think one of the funniest stories in the entire Bible is found in Exodus 16. And not funny because, the story itself is comical, but funny just because of the context that it happens in. So this Exodus 16, this is right after the parting of the sea, right after they sing all these songs of praise to God for what he's done in their life and the deliverance that he's given them. And then this happens. Exodus 16, starting in verse 1. The whole Israelite community set out from Elim and came to the desert of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month after they had come out of Egypt. Okay, pause there for a second. So 15th day of the second month, a month is 28 days in the Hebrew reckoning, and so this is 43 days after they made it out of Egypt. 43 days, 6 weeks. That's all this is. Continues in verse 2. In the desert, the whole community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The Israelites said to them, "If only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted, but you have brought us out into the desert to starve this entire assembly to death." 6 weeks. It took them 6 weeks to forget about what God had delivered them from and what they had gone through in Egypt. It took them 6 weeks to get uncomfortable in the desert and to believe that God was no longer with them and had abandoned them, and that it would be better for them to go back. It took them 6 weeks to believe that God wasn't going to provide for their needs. But of course, God does provide for their needs. He provides for them then through both quail in the evening and then a mysterious bread, manna, each morning. And then in Exodus 19, the narrative shifts. As the Israelites reach Mount Sinai, this mountain, often shrouded in smoke and fire, becomes the meeting place for God and Moses for the next 20 chapters 20 to 40. It's on this sacred ground that God reveals his character and establishes a new covenant with his people. The covenant encapsulated in the Ten Commandments in Exodus 20 and then expanded on in the next few verses, chapters 20 through 23, lays the foundation for the moral and ethical framework that will guide the lives of the Israelites in the years that follow. So Moses comes down from the mountain then after receiving these instructions, and we see this in Exodus 24:7. Then Moses took the book of the covenant and read it to the people, and they responded, "We will do everything that the Lord has said. We will obey." The people heard what God required of them and said, "Yes, we will do that." And then you can probably guess what happens next, because they, then promptly don't do that. Flash forward a few chapters, Moses has gone back up the mountain. He is now getting instructions from God about how to construct the tabernacle, but we'll get there in a second. But Moses is up there for 40 days, and the Israelites make what I would say is actually a fairly reasonable assumption, that Moses is probably not coming back. If someone goes missing for 40 days and we can't account for them, I understand why they would just assume that he's not coming back. But then the Israelites do the slightly more unreasonable thing. And they say to Aaron, "Come, make us gods who will go before us." And Aaron and the people then use the gold that they had received from the Egyptians. This gold that they had gotten on their way out of being delivered from Egypt, this gold that God intended for a holy, sacred purpose to be a blessing to the people of Israel. They use that for an idolatrous purpose, making a golden calf for the people to worship. And this act of rebellion is made all the more poignant when framed in the context of the chapters around it. Because like I said, Moses is up on the mountain receiving instructions from God about how to create the tabernacle while all of this is happening. And we see those instructions laid out in meticulous detail in chapters 25 to 31, and then in many cases repeated almost verbatim in chapters 35 to 39. You see, 25 to 31 are the instructions to Moses about how to do it, and then 35 to 39 is the story of the people actually doing it. The construction of the tabernacle then becomes the tangible expression of God's desire to dwell with his people. The intricate design and craftsmanship of the tabernacle reflect the holiness and glory of God, and in many cases it harkens back to the Garden of Eden. The tabernacle is meant to be seen as a new Eden, a new dwelling place for God and man to be in right relationship with one another. And so how much more painful is it then for both God and humanity that just as God is trying to give them the instructions of how they can return to being in relationship with him, how he and humans can dwell together, that as that's happening, humanity is breaking their covenant with God and sinning, creating an idol, and doing the very thing that keeps us from being able to dwell with God in the first place, being imperfect and sinning. So the book ends then on a kind of disappointing note. Exodus 34 to 35 says this: "Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Moses could not enter the tent of meeting because the cloud had settled on it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle." The story ends with even Moses being unable to enter the tabernacle when God's presence is there. Even Moses cannot do the thing that was the very point of the tabernacle in the first place, all because the people of Israel broke the covenant that they promised to uphold. As we reflect on the Exodus narrative, it becomes evident that this journey is not just a historical account, but it's a spiritual allegory. First, we learn a great deal about God the Father in the midst of it. He cares for his people. He will not abandon them to oppression and ruin. Now, that's not to say that he immediately saves his people from any trial or difficulty. The Israelites still spent centuries in slavery in Egypt, but God never forgot them. And I think it's deeply significant that this is the history of our faith, that it stems from a people who found themselves in slavery. How different would the story of our faith be if the Israelites were not the captives, but the captors? How different would it be if Moses were speaking not to a foreign ruler, but to the king of the Israelites? But God shows us consistently that he is always for the oppressed and the overlooked. He has always been in the business of setting the captive free. Equally important then is the story of Moses and in the story of Moses and the Israelites is the fact that there's a shadow of deliverance and covenant with God that is accomplished through Jesus Christ. There's a foretaste of what God's going to do in and through Jesus. In the New Testament, Jesus becomes the ultimate fulfillment of the Exodus narrative. He's the Passover lamb whose blood brings liberation from bondage to sin. And Jesus leads his people through a journey through the wilderness of this world into the ultimate promised land, eternal fellowship with him. The book of Exodus is more than a historical account of a people's liberation. It's a testament to God's faithfulness, his redemptive plan, and the establishment of a covenant relationship with his people. Moses is a foretaste not of our own strength and our own power and our own ability to overcome, but instead of the power of God at work in the world, seeking to set the captives free and offer a way for God and his people to dwell together once again. And this is the hope that we find fulfilled in the person of Jesus, our deliverer, the good news for all nations, all people, who has now set us free from the chains of sin and death that bind us. Jesus truly is good news.